Let me tell you a story that will make you stop and think. Picture this. In a lively, bustling village, there was a couple named Amara and Kwame.
They didn't have much, a small house, nothing fancy, but it was bursting with love. Amara had a smile so warm it could light up a room, and Kwame was strong, dependable, and ready to do whatever it took for his family. They had 4 daughters, each one beautiful, shining like little stars. But here's the thing. Life was tough, really tough. Kwame worked every single day on other people's farms, doing hard labor just to scrape together enough for food. And Amara? She didn't sit back. No way. She fetched water, washed clothes for others, and hauled heavy loads at the market to earn whatever extra she could. Together, they worked their hearts out, but it was never quite enough. Their daughters were growing, and you know what that means. They needed books, pencils, uniforms. But sometimes Amara and Kwame just couldn't afford it. There were days when the girls had to leave school early because the fees weren't paid. Imagine that. It broke their hearts, but they didn't give up. They played with their kids, laughed with them, and made sure their home was still filled with happiness, even when life was hard. Their little house was alive with laughter and the sound of tiny feet running around. And every night, under a sky filled with stars, Amara and Kwame would sit outside, holding hands. They would dream together about a better future for their daughters. They didn't know how they'd get there, but they believed. That's the kind of hope that keeps you going, no matter what. Then one morning, Kwame woke up with this heavy feeling in his chest. He knew he couldn't just sit and wait for things to change. Something had to be done. So, he made a bold decision. He was going to the next village to see his friend and ask for help. The walk was long, the sun was blazing, but all Kwame could think about was his family, his wife, his girls. He was determined. When he got to his friend's house, he shared everything. "I need help," Kwame said. "Can you lend me some money?" His friend listened carefully, then said something unexpected. "Kwame, I won't just give you fish. I'll teach you how to catch them." Powerful, right? Kwame didn't fully understand, but he trusted his friend. Together, they went to see an old man called the Sangoma who lived deep in the forest. The Sangoma's house was strange. It had odd symbols, weird plants growing all around, and the air smelled like something ancient. Kwame felt a shiver go down his spine as he stepped inside. The Sangoma listened quietly to Kwame's story. Then, with eyes that seemed to see straight into his soul, he made an offer. "I can make you rich," he said, "but there's a price." Kwame leaned forward. "What kind of price?" he asked. "You must use your children in the ritual," the Sangoma said. "They won't die, but they will suffer." Kwame froze. He was horrified. "No, I can't do that," he said. "I'm trying to help my kids, not hurt them." But the Sangoma wasn't finished. "Now that you've heard this," he said calmly, "if you leave, you won't survive the journey home." Kwame felt trapped. He thought about his little house, his daughters who needed school, the empty pots at dinner. His heart was heavy, but in his desperation, he agreed. The Sangoma handed him a pouch of black powder. "Mix this into their food," he instructed. Kwame took the pouch, his mind racing, and began the long walk back home. When Kwame returned, he followed the Sangoma's instructions. He put a little bit of the black powder into his daughter's food. He prayed it wouldn't harm them. He told himself everything would be okay. He had to believe it. But the next day, something strange happened. A powerful wind swept through the village, shaking doors and rattling trees. Everyone was talking about it. It wasn't a normal wind. And then, Kwame's worst fear came true. His eldest daughter, the brightest light in their family, suddenly lost her sight. She cried out, "Everything is dark." Kwame's heart shattered. He wanted to believe it was the strange wind, just a coincidence. But deep down, he knew the truth. It was the powder. It was the deal he made. Let's talk about the choices we make and the prices we pay. The villagers were whispering about the strange wind and Kwame's daughter suddenly going blind. Something wasn't right. Then, out of nowhere, a mysterious man showed up in the village, dressed in black from head to toe, carrying a heavy sack. He walked straight to Kwame and Amara's house like he knew exactly where to go. "I've heard about your daughter's misfortune," he said, his smile unsettling. "I've come to help." Before leaving, he handed them the sack and warned, "Don't open it until I'm gone." Amara and Kwame were confused but hopeful. As soon as the man disappeared, they opened the sack. It was full of gold coins. Gold. For the first time, they felt relief. They laughed, danced, and held each other, thinking their troubles were finally over. But as the sunlight hit the coins, Amara glanced at her blind daughter and felt a chill. The wealth came, but at what cost? Kwame tried to reassure her. "It's just fate," he said. But deep down he knew this was only the beginning. Now rich, Kwame and Amara's lives transformed. They bought big farms, the largest store in the market, and a beautiful house with many rooms. People in the village admired them. Their daughters wore the prettiest clothes, ate the best food, and had everything they could want. The villagers even started calling them princesses. It seemed perfect, but perfection comes with shadows. Their eldest daughter was still blind. Amara begged Kwame to use some of their money to take her to a healer, but Kwame refused every time. "That's her destiny," he said. "We can't change it." Amara was heartbroken for her daughter but didn't know how to fight against Kwame's decision. She trusted him, but doubt crept in. Why wouldn't he help their child? The villagers also wondered, whispering behind their backs. But no one dared to confront Kwame. Meanwhile, the family's wealth only grew, and so did the unspoken sadness in their home. Kwame and Amara tried to focus on their new life, but the cost of that life weighed heavier each day. 2 years passed. On the surface, Kwame and Amara seemed to have everything. Their farms flourished, their business thrived, and their daughters enjoyed a life of luxury. But the shadow of their eldest daughter's blindness hung over them. Then one day, Kwame received a message. The Sangoma was calling him back. Kwame knew what it meant. He went to the forest, where the Sangoma told him, "It's time to renew your wealth. This time, you must sacrifice your second daughter." Kwame's heart sank. He didn't want to do it, but the Sangoma warned, "If you refuse, you will lose everything and go mad." Desperation clawed at him. Feeling trapped once again, Kwame agreed. He returned home, mixing more of the black powder into his children's food. The next morning, his second daughter lost her ability to speak and hear. She was deaf and dumb. Amara cried for her child, begging Kwame to help, but he repeated the same words. It's her fate. A few days later, the man in black returned, claiming he was just passing through. He asked to stay the night. By morning, he was gone, but he left behind another sack of gold. Kwame and Amara were rich again, but this time Amara couldn't ignore her growing suspicions. She begged Kwame to use some of the money to help their second daughter, but he refused. It's just the way things are, he said firmly. We can't change it. Amara stayed silent, confused and scared. The family continued to live in wealth, but now 2 of their daughters were suffering. The laughter in their home grew quieter, replaced by heavy silences and lingering sadness. And this wasn't the end. It became a pattern. Every time Kwame visited the Sangoma, another daughter fell ill. The man in black would appear shortly after, bringing more money. Each time, Kwame's wealth grew, but the joy in their home withered. The girls, once full of laughter and energy, became quiet and withdrawn. Amara's doubts turned into fear. Why was this happening? And why did Kwame seem so different? She watched him closely. His eyes, once bright with hope, were now dark and distant. He carried secrets, ones he refused to share. Amara didn't know what to do, but she knew something was deeply wrong. One day, Amara couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She decided to follow Kwame, staying out of sight as he left their home. She crept behind bushes and trees, careful not to be seen. Kwame walked deep into the forest, straight to the Sangoma's hut. Amara stayed at a distance, her heart racing as she watched. Inside, Kwame and the Sangoma spoke in hushed tones. Amara crept closer, straining to hear. Her stomach twisted as their words became clear. They were talking about the sacrifices. Kwame had been behind all the suffering their daughters endured. He had made the deals. Amara was frozen with shock. She couldn't believe it. The man she loved, the father of her children, had done this. A wave of emotions hit her all at once. Anger, sorrow, fear. She wanted to scream, to run, to tell someone, anyone. But the Sangoma's words echoed in her mind. If the truth comes out, you'll go mad. Terrified, Amara knew she couldn't risk it. When Kwame left the hut, Amara hid. She watched him return home, his steps slow and heavy. Amara stayed behind for a moment, trying to gather her thoughts. She felt helpless, trapped by the secret. How could she protect her family now? She returned home with a heavy heart, looking at her daughters with guilt and sadness. They didn't deserve this. Time passed, and Amara carried the burden alone. Their wealth remained, but the cost of keeping it grew heavier on her heart. Then, one day, Kwame received another message from the Sangoma. Amara's chest tightened as she realized what it meant. Another ritual, another sacrifice. At the Sangoma's hut, Kwame was told this time it had to be their last daughter, the only one still healthy. Kwame felt the weight of the Sangoma's words. He couldn't bear the thought of harming his last child. After a sleepless night, he returned home, his steps slow and uneven, his face dark with guilt. Amara noticed something was wrong. "I know where you went," she said, her voice trembling. "You went to see the Sangoma. What happened, Kwame?" Kwame sat down, his shoulders slumped. "The Sangoma says we need to do more to keep the wealth," he said quietly. "Another ritual, a terrible one." Amara's heart broke. She cried and begged him not to go through with it. Her love for her children outweighed everything. Desperate, she decided to confront the Sangoma herself. She knelt before him, tears streaming down her face. "Please," she begged. "There has to be another way. I can't let my last child suffer." The Sangoma studied her for a moment, then said, "There is another way, but it will cost you greatly." "What is it?" Amara asked. "We will create a wound on Kwame's leg," the Sangoma explained. "You must lick it every day. As long as you do this, the wealth will remain, but if you tell anyone, you will die." The thought of licking a wound repulsed Amara, but the thought of losing her daughter was unbearable. She looked at Kwame. He nodded reluctantly, knowing they had no other choice. The next day, the Sangoma made the wound. It was deep and painful, and Kwame winced as the Sangoma worked her. Amara fought back her disgust and steeled herself. She began the ritual, licking the wound as tears ran down her face. Every day she repeated the act, and just as promised, the wealth continued to grow. The man in black returned more often, leaving behind sacks of gold. Their riches seemed endless. But for Amara, the ritual became unbearable. The wound never healed. Each day, it grew darker, and a foul smell began to cling to her. No matter how many times she washed, it wouldn't leave. She grew weaker, her once bright eyes dimming. She no longer looked like herself. The villagers began to notice. People whispered as Amara passed by. "What's wrong with her?" they murmured. Children who used to run to her now stayed far away, wrinkling their noses at the smell. Amara's friends stopped visiting, leaving her isolated and lonely. The joy she once carried was gone. Kwame watched her with guilt weighing on him. He knew the truth, but said nothing. Amara was suffering because of his choices. Their home, once filled with laughter, now felt empty and cold. Their daughters, confused and scared, whispered to each other at night. "What's happening to Mama?" they asked. They couldn't understand why their mother was changing or why the house felt so dark, even with all the wealth around them. Amara's strength began to fade. Each day the ritual took more from her. The villagers whispered louder, wondering what secrets the family was hiding. And as the shadow of their choices loomed larger, the weight of the truth became unbearable for both Amara and Kwame. Amara's condition got worse every day, and the villagers began avoiding her altogether. The foul smell that followed her everywhere was unbearable, and the whispers grew louder. People were convinced that something unnatural was happening in the once happy home. Despite their riches, the family seemed trapped in their luxurious prison, cut off from the rest of the world. Amara and Kwame felt their dark secret pulling them deeper into despair. One bright morning, the village elders finally decided enough was enough. The oldest and wisest among them, a sharp-eyed man named Oba, called the villagers to gather under the great baobab tree. "We cannot stand by and watch one of our own waste away like this," he said, his voice steady and firm. "We must find out what is happening in Kwame and Amara's home." The crowd agreed, though many looked nervous. The elders marched to Kwame's house and demanded that he take Amara to a healer. Kwame, exhausted and defeated, tried to wave them off. "It's just an illness," he said. "She'll get better soon." But Oba wasn't buying it. "No more lies, Kwame," he said sharply. "Tell us the truth, now." When Kwame refused, the elders sent strong men to his house to carry Amara to the healer if needed. They found her barely able to stand, trembling and weak. Gently, they lifted her and carried her to the center of the village, where the healer, a wise woman named Ifeoma, was waiting. Kwame tried to stop them, but the villagers tied him up to make sure he couldn't interfere. At Ifeoma's hut, the villagers crowded around, desperate for answers. The healer began her rituals, chanting softly as she waved her hands over Amara and Kwame. The tension in the air was thick. Finally, Ifeoma fixed them with a piercing stare and said, "Tell us what you have done." The truth must come out. Kwame and Amara sat frozen in terror, unwilling to speak. But Ifeoma pressed harder, her voice unwavering. "The truth will set you free." Kwame broke first. His voice shook as he confessed, "I used my daughters in rituals. The Sangoma told me to do it, and I agreed. I mixed black powder into their food. That's why they suffered." Amara sobbed and added, "I licked the wound on Kwame's leg every day to keep our wealth. I did it to save our last daughter, but it made me sick." The crowd gasped in disbelief. Their horror was palpable. How could anyone do such terrible things to their own children? Then, something unbelievable happened. As Kwame and Amara finished their confession, their eldest daughter, who had been blind, suddenly regained her sight. The second daughter, who couldn't hear or speak, began to talk. The third, who had been weak and ill, was suddenly strong again. The villagers stood in stunned silence as the family's daughters were restored before their eyes. Oba stepped forward, his face grim. "Kwame, for the suffering you have caused your family and this village, you must face punishment." Before anyone could move, Kwame let out a wild scream. His eyes rolled back and he tore at his clothes, laughing maniacally. Without warning, he bolted into the forest, disappearing among the trees. The villagers watched in shock as his screams faded into the distance. Kwame was never seen again. The elders then turned to Amara. "You knew the truth and kept it hidden," they said. "You caused pain by staying silent. For that you must leave the village." Amara dropped to her knees, pleading for forgiveness. But the elders were firm. She was banished. With tears streaming down her face, Amara left, her heart heavy with regret. All she could hope was that her daughters would forgive her one day. But the villagers, full of compassion, took in Amara's daughters. They raised the girls with care and love, ensuring they were happy and safe. Surrounded by kindness, the daughters grew strong, supported by the entire community.
And so, the story of Amara and Kwame ended as a powerful reminder. Wealth gained through betrayal and sacrifice brings only suffering. True happiness comes from love, honesty, and integrity. The village thrived, and the tale of Amara and Kwame was passed down for generations, a warning of the cost of losing sight of what truly matters in life.